What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. I have hosted and produced over 2,000 epic conversations over the last 10 years. And what makes our conversations epic? We don't do interviews. We do conversations. What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. My friend is rolling his eyes, says he does say that all the time. Yes, I do. And I'd just like to say I'm also a certified empowerment coach, president and CEO of Express Your Vibe Coaching and Communications. And as I like to say, the Dr. Vibe Show is the home of epic conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations. So we have another new friend on the Dr. Vibe Show tonight. I am really excited about having this friend, and I hope he allows me to call him a friend on the Dr. Vibe Show. Let me just share with you who he is. It is Dr. John Izzo. He is the best-selling author of 7 books, including the international bestsellers, Awakening Corporate Soul, Value Shift, 5 Secrets You Must Discover Before You Die. The 5 Thieves of Happiness and Stepping Up. His passion helping organizations activate purpose in employees and customers has inspired him to write his 8th book, The Purpose Revolution: How Leaders Create Engagement and Competitive Advantage in an Age of Social Good, which is going to be released on March 13th, 2018. So he's a deadline guy. So everybody, you need to listen to him. He's a deadline guy. He puts it out there. Over the last 20 years, he's spoken to over 1 million people, taught at 3 major universities, advised over 500 organizations, and is frequently featured in the media by the likes of Fast Company, PBS, CBC, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, and Inc. magazine. He's advised some of the best companies in the world on activating purpose, including DuPont, TELUS, Manulife, McDonald's, SAPA, RBC, Lockheed Martin, Qantas Airlines, Humana, Microsoft, and the Mayo Clinic. He was a pioneer in the corporate social responsibility and sustainability movements and is an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia, where he is co-founder of the Men's Initiative, which is dedicated to creating a more, quote, equitable, compassionate, and sustainable world through enhancing the well-being and the integrity of men. He also serves on the advisory board of Sustainable Brands. Now, you're going to ask, how do I meet a gentleman that's so damn busy? Well, we had the blessing of meeting each other back in November. There was a conference in Toronto called the Men and Masculinity Conference, and there was breakout sessions. It was their leadership night. And I had the privilege of sitting with a group of people, including this wonderful young man. And we began chatting back and forth, and I realized this is the keynote speaker. Oh my. But then I didn't realize the keynote speaker humbled me by mentioning me 2 or 3 times in his keynote presentation. And I told people first, I did not pay John, first of all, but we just had a wonderful conversation. I said, some way, somehow, I'd like John to share his evaluated knowledge and experience on the Dr. Vibe. So he is here tonight, and we'll have a great conversation about Fathers Without Borders. So welcome, hopefully for the first time and not the last time, Dr. John Izzo. Dr. John, how are you this evening?
I'm wonderful, Dr. Vibe, and it's great to see you. And my eyes were not rolling, more going up to heaven. Thankful that you're doing all the good work that you're doing. And as you said, we made an instant connection in Toronto of the heart.
Yes.
And, it doesn't always happen among men. So I'm thrilled to be here and thankful for the work that you're doing and looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent, John. Well, we've heard a lot about your corporate and educational life. Can you share, like we always like to do our friends the first time, give a little background. Where did you grow up, life growing up?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in New York City. Mother was Canadian, father was American. I only had 3 things I wanted to do with my life as a young man. I either wanted to become a journalist and write about all the things that were happening in the world so we could create a better world and tell people stories. I wanted to go to law school and go into politics. I grew up thinking of politics not as a dirty profession, but as a noble profession to really influence society or to become an ordained Presbyterian minister. And that is the path that I chose, was to become an ordained minister. I spent 8 years in the parish. A very powerful time in my life. I got to be with people in the most important moments of their life, good and bad, the births, the deaths, the weddings, the funerals, the crises, the illness, the growing old. And long story short, I went back to get a PhD thinking I would maybe teach in the seminary. I might teach other preachers to preach. And a long story short, I got a fire in the belly for the impact that work had on people's lives, and felt a calling to go and work in the corporate world to try to humanize it, make it a more noble place. And as I like to tell people, I wound up marrying all three of my careers. I've written books to, tell the stories of people who are doing great things and how we can do more of that. I've been involved in issues that I care about, not as a politician, but as an advocate, whether it's the environment or helping men become better men. And finally, I get to preach all the time. I give about 70 talks a year. Wow. At big conferences and in inside companies. And it's even better than preaching because I can give the same speech over and over again. So that helps.
Nice. Where did the influence come from to go the journey that you've gone? Was it family? Was it mother? Where did that influence come from to do social good?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just did an interview this morning about my new book, The Purpose Revolution. And the interviewer asked me about the dedication to the book, because I dedicated this particular book to my mother, who died last April, and to a mentor in my life. So I think these two people are a big explanation. So my mother was a single mother. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that, but raised an only child on her own, worked all those years, had a very hard life in a lot of ways, but she was a very purpose-driven woman, a very religious woman. And also, I remember growing up in an integrated neighborhood in New York City, and being the only white kid in the neighborhood who, of course, I could go into the homes of black people and play. And it wasn't even, I couldn't even imagine why other kids were not allowed to do that, right? Because my mother, that's the kind of person that she was, right? Well, why wouldn't you, And so my mother was very much, make something of your life. You're here for a purpose. Don't waste it just chasing after money or status. So I'm sure that was drummed into me from when I was very, very young, the power of service. And then I met a minister when I was in junior high school, Robert Kelly. And Bob Kelly was really the epitome of a servant leader. In the height of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, he used his voice as a white minister to speak about the issues of our time. And not only that, but took a very personal interest in me. And so I think he was probably the first good man who had a big influence on my life. Again, I'm sure we'll get into that, but in many ways, he was my first father, if you think about it in that way, an older man who took an interest in my potential and in molding me. So I think those two people certainly had the biggest influence on my journey, and probably a great reminder to me of the power we have, whether we're someone's father or not, to have an influence on people in our lives.
Because of that influence, of that father influence at a young age, I want to stick to your mother for a moment. Other than the dedication, what other characteristics do you feel she's instilled to you that you carry on to today?
A couple of things. One is her sense of humor. My mother used to say, no matter what happens, I wake up in the morning happy. Wow. And I've taken that characteristic, meaning to have a sense of grace about life. It's not going to be perfect. And, I think looking at the way my mother died in the end, with such grace and courage, Even in the end, she witnessed to me the power. She was joking even in the end. I remember one night I stayed with her the last week of her life, and she's like, "Why are you hanging around like a mother hen? Just like go home, for God's sakes, right?" Yeah. And so her sense of humor, her work ethic for sure, her willingness to work hard, and I think her kindness to all people. Not to be a respecter of status or of someone because they could do something for you, but to be a respecter of someone because of just them being a human being. And I think that that's something people have said to me, even though I've spoken all over the world. One of the greatest compliments I feel I get is when someone says to me, "Wow, you were the same person off the stage that you are on the stage." And I say that not as an ego statement, but I think I got that from my mother, and to large part, in that, no matter what I've achieved in my life, I'm just a human being, a fellow journeyer. I don't think I'm better or worse than anyone else. And so I think those three things are the qualities that most of all she gave to me.
Excellent. You spent a lot of time in the world, corporate world, etc. When did you feel you needed to go deeper and look at manhood? Men, when were there some events in your life saying that, I've got to look deeper into men?
It's interesting. In some ways, I was brought kicking and screaming to this conversation about men, which when we talk about my own history is a bit ironic. My partner Janice says in some ways my whole life has been a preparation to do men's work, but I didn't know it. And so when my friend David Kuhl, who's a physician and a psychologist, went on sabbatical, and he had always been doing work with soldiers and men coming back from Afghanistan and men with prostate cancer and various men's groups. And I slowly began to, I guess, realize that that you can't really heal the planet and society if men are not healed. If men don't step up in a different way into their own manhood in a positive way, and also maybe came to see my own need to heal as a man, right? That maybe something that I had ignored for many years, the woundedness that I carried from the men in my own life as a young man, and although I had found a way to work that out in my own life. I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could help more men find that in the company of other men for the benefit of the world and families. So again, I kind of came kicking and screaming in some ways, but I believe that the door opens up for us in life at the right time. And frankly, I wouldn't have been really prepared to do this work with men 20 years ago, because I hadn't really taken a lot of the journeys that I've taken. And so in some ways the door is opened, I think, at just the time that I feel most capable of helping other men, through some of the things that I've gone through myself.
Excellent. How did the studying of men start? How did you get it started? Because you said, I got to do this. How did it start?
Yeah. Well, again, David and Duncan, my two co-founders, had been doing work with soldiers for some time. And Duncan was a therapist who was the guy they'd send the tough men to. So, the men who were violent, the men who couldn't control themselves. Duncan was the guy that they sent them to. Because in some ways he was a man's man. He'd been in the military. He can fix things, but he had that softer side that we as men must also evolve and develop. And so David had these strong academic credentials and all this work he'd done with soldiers. Duncan was the guy who the tough men came to. And I was the guy with the business background, and probably more experience, starting and running businesses. And so, the three of us came together, and, we were incredibly lucky or fortunate because the Blackmore family gave us a rather large donation with no strings attached to start the center. As a fundraising guy said to us, it was really a unicorn, but we didn't know it, a very rare thing. But this family really saw the importance of this work for men. And so that's how we started, and we're affiliated with the University of British Columbia, but we're not an academic program. We're doing work in the world with men to help them become better men, and also developing programs that we can then give away for others to do, and researching what's working in terms of men, because there's a lot of things being done out there, but we don't know whether they're working. So let's make sure the things we're doing with men are working, so we can replicate the best practice for moving men to a more positive place. So that's how it got started, and we're still a startup in many ways, but we've already have a program for firefighters that is going nationwide, that really helps firefighters shift that male culture to a place where we can talk about trauma and hurt. We have done a fascinating project with Heineken Mexico, getting men to talk to other men about how to be more inclusive and be more welcoming of others who are not like us. And we're now exploring a men in sport program, trying to see if we can get a program that would cut across the leagues in the United States and Canada, where men would really look at themselves and try to use their platform for a more positive role model deliberately for young men.
Wonderful. Well, a few things before you go further. First of all, I want to say condolences on the loss of your mother, first and foremost. And when you do see your two colleagues, do tell them I say hello. I did also have a chance to meet them at the Men and Masculinity Summit. So I do hope they're doing well, and do say my best wishes to them.
Thank you, and same back. We were all impressed with our time with you.
Thank you so much. Well, the balance of our conversation is talking about Fathers Without Borders, and we were chatting a few days ago, and we came up with this subject. And tell me, why did you want to chat about this subject at this time?
Well, I think of all the things that influences men, the role models early in our life have the biggest influence. You've heard me tell this story, but your listeners haven't, that a friend of mine was a healer on one of the Gulf Islands here in British Columbia. And someone said, "What's a healer?" And I said, "Well, a healer is a therapist without credentials." And in some ways it's true. Like Ross was one of those people, he didn't need a degree. Right. To know how to, nothing against getting a degree. Right. But, even though he didn't have the degrees, he had the gift to usher people to a different place in their lives. And so for years, the women on this little island had been bugging him to start a group for men. They said, Ross, the men are really suffering in silence. They need to talk to each other about sex, about life, about relationships, about fatherhood, all these things. And Ross said, "Look, ladies, men don't want to come and talk to each other. If they did, they would. So, basically, don't bother me, because they're not going to come even if I do it." So they bugged him for such a long time that he finally made a deal with them. He said, "I'll tell you what, a month from now on Wednesday night, I'm going to have a group for men. I'm going to put it up in the post office where you have to go to check your mail on the little island, where every man can see it for a month. And if hardly anybody shows up, I want you to leave me alone." And frankly, that was what he anticipated. So he waited, and when that night came a month later, something around 37 or 38 men showed up that first night.
Wow. And
Ross said to me, "To be honest, John, I hadn't really prepared anything, because I expect maybe we'll get a couple of men and we just sit and shoot the breeze." So suddenly I've got 37, 38 men who've come expecting something, and I don't know what they expect. So he said, it wasn't until the end of the 3 hours that I realized that every one of the men had come because they wanted to talk about their relationship with their father. Yeah. And he said, now, they didn't say that. They didn't say, "Oh, by the way, I came to talk about my father." But he said, by the end of the night, I realized every one of those men, in one way or another, had come because of the relationship they had had with their father, good, bad, or indifferent. Either they had a great relationship with their father and they wanted to be the kind of father or man their father was, or they had an absent or tortured relationship with their father and they wanted to be a different man than their father was. And I've never forgotten that story, right? So I think the father, and not just the father, but all the men in our lives when we're really young as boys, have an incredible impact on our view of ourselves and our view of the world, of relationships, what it means to be a man. So I think this issue of fatherhood, but not just fatherhood in the traditional way we think about it, the father to the son, but the way in which all of us are fathers. Fathers to young men who aren't our children, like Bob Kelly was to me. Fathers, whether because we're uncles, or fathers to the friends
Yes.
in our lives. And maybe finally, even fathers to ourselves.
Yep.
When eventually we have the chance to become the fathers to ourselves that maybe we wish we had had.
It's very true. I don't know if when we chatted pre-chat before this, I hosted a conversation last Wednesday evening on the Bell Let's Talk Day. And we had there's a conversation of Black men and mental health, and only 5 people pre-registered. So I said, okay, but it ended up to have 35 men there.
Wow.
And it's so interesting you're mentioning this, that we're talking about this tonight, because the issue of fatherhood in the relationship and the relationship with their fathers, whether they were there or not, was the dominant conversation piece. And it was an incredible conversation, because I had an agenda that I wanted to share. But you know what? I wanted first time out to have a comfortable space for them to communicate and share with each other. And it was just amazing that most of the gentlemen there did not have a great relationship with their father.
Yeah, I know. It is unfortunately a very common tale, right? And interestingly, all 3 of us, Duncan, David, and myself, all had a variety of less than good relationships with our fathers. And ironically, we're all fathers of only daughters.
Wow.
So we have 5 daughters between us and not 1 son, which is kind of interesting.
So when you are I'll use the example of the Men's Initiative. When you're working with firefighters, this issue of fatherhood, what are they telling you their backgrounds, their journey of fatherhood, and what are you hearing? Is it a common story that you're hearing amongst most of these gentlemen?
Well, I think generally even though the stories vary quite a bit, again, I think one of 2 things are often true of the relationships we have with our fathers. One is this theme of absence. And absence comes in many forms. There's physical absence. And that physical absence can be literal, or it can be day to day, like the father who's too busy to work. It's like Harry Chapin's song, Cats in the Cradle. The father's there, but he's too busy, right, to really be there. So there's either the fully absent father, the physically absent father, or the emotionally absent father. The father unable to truly talk about the things that matter with his or her son, and the role model that comes from that to us as young men. I often use the example around sexuality. The research shows the vast majority of young men in our society learn almost all their information about sex from pornography. And no wonder we've got such a problem with, harassment and male sexuality and even impotence and all of this, right? So ironically, as men, we talk about sex all the time, but we don't actually talk about sexuality with each other. And so there's another way the father can be absent from the important conversations that a young man must have. And I love what David says. Again, we're only fathers of daughters. But he said, I realized early on, he said, there's things that my wife can teach a daughter that I can't teach them no matter how great a father I am, because I don't know the journey of being a woman. And I think sometimes as men, again, whether we're fathers literally or going to be fathers without a border for another young man in our lives, is that there are things we as men, and only as men, can teach young men, because we're the ones who have taken the journey of being a man. And so I think we need to remember how important we are. And I think the diminishment of fatherhood, and if you think about how fathers are portrayed, mostly as bumbling idiots, a la Homer Simpson, unable to do the basic tasks of life, let alone be a good father, right? The mothers, on the other hand, often, very different. And contrast that with the previous generation. I grew up watching Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Now, we know there were lots of problems with that world, too, where women were often diminished. But those fathers were fathers of substance who talked to their kids, right? Who were present even though they worked. And it's been replaced by the bumbling Homer Simpson father, and I think it's quite telling that that's the image that we have now of the father.
In what you've just shared with our audience, the change in the portrayal of fathers, what do you feel have been some of the root causes of this portrayal change?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe part of it is, there's no doubt that even in that previous generation, fathers were often emotionally absent. And yet, there was a role in those days that fathers play. The father as provider, the father as the kind of warrior who went out into the world. The father as the one who came home. You have to deal with your father when he comes home, right? That as dysfunctional as that model was, the father had a role, right, that was kind of clear. I think a part of it is that we don't know what the role is that replaces that kind of father, right? It's certainly not Homer Simpson, right? But we don't really have that image of, and again, I'm being a little unfair because certainly there have been movies and TV shows that have portrayed a more positive, modern image of a father who talks about his life with his kids, who is vulnerable, who is willing to talk about his challenges and difficulties, and to be both compassionate and strong, right? But so I don't know how it happened, but it may also be a representation of the experience many of us have had with our fathers, an exaggeration of the experience we had with our fathers.
Would you also say in today's world of, quote, busyness, unquote, that men don't have time, as much time as maybe previous generations, to become or work on their fatherhood?
Yeah, well, the average man and woman have much less discretionary time for family than they did in that Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver generation. That's a fact. It's not something that's made up. And in many ways, when the mother was staying at home as the traditional pattern, I don't want to say the father could get by with being a little less, fatherly, but it's probably true, right? Because the mother kind of did all the hard stuff, and then the father could kind of come in and, have the little talk when he needed to. That's not the world we live in now. Both the father and the mother are often time-starved. And so we have to be even more intentional about how we use the time that we have and making the time for these things.
When you get the opportunity to have conversations with fathers, what are some of the common challenges you hear coming from their hearts and their minds?
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on this
but you do
piece.
talk to a lot of men.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think, that I think many men don't know how to have those kinds of conversations. They didn't have a role model. Their fathers didn't talk to them about sex, really. Fathers didn't necessarily talk to them about life in the way maybe we would have wanted them to. I think many men, even if they have really positive relationships with their father, it was more as a role model. Yeah. So they were watching that father be a good man, a good father, but they didn't necessarily, they kind of wished the father had talked to them more about what was actually going on inside. And I think that's one of the things that I hear is we don't always know how to have those conversations, to be vulnerable, to talk about what's actually going on inside. And I do think fathers often feel a little bit like second-class citizens kind of like I do with my dog. I always say like my dog is like, which is the surrogate, by the way. When the kids leave the house, the dog becomes like the equivalent of the kid. And I know this because when our puppy was young, one morning I happened to lay in bed a little longer, and the dog was cuddling with me. And Janice said, now don't waste this cuddle bonding time with her. And I thought, oh my God, it's like parenthood all over again. I'm blowing it again. Now with the dog, I'm on it. So I say that because there is an inadequacy that fathers, I think, often feel. Because frankly, mothers are naturally better at it. I think that's true. I don't mean all mothers.
Right.
But I do think women have a little more natural affinity for parenting. And it makes sense genetically and evolutionary from an evolutionary perspective. So I think men often feel like second class, like citizens, but we don't have to be like mothers. We have to kind of think about what it means to be a good father, which isn't necessarily always going to be the same as being an effective mother. We may never be as good at them as some things, but maybe there are things we can teach that are unique to us as well.
I'm looking at the title of our conversation, Fathers Without Borders. What would a world be like if fathers had borders?
Yeah, it's kind of a double entendre, right? This father without borders. Because on the one hand, fathers without borders is the last thing we want.
Right.
Fathers with no borders of their behavior, fathers with no borders around sexuality, fathers with no borders about the impact they might have by their role model. So when I talk about fathers without borders, I'm thinking more like doctors without borders, right? The idea is that you're a doctor wherever you are, right? And it's not just about, where you're having your practice per se. And in some ways for me, Fathers Without Borders is thinking that as a man, I have the chance to be a father in almost every context of my life.
Right.
If there's a young man in the workplace, I have a chance to be a surrogate father for that person as their manager or a mentor. If I have a friend who needs someone to father them, and what does a good father do? A good father nurtures, but a good father also molds. A good father holds us accountable to our best selves, right? And so I think, to me, Fathers Without Borders is a way of thinking in all the relationships of my life. How can I be a good father in the best sense of what a father does? Holds accountable, shares my own struggles and journey, gives sound advice, and listens deeply to other men and encourages them to speak what's in their heart. And, Dr. Vibe, I joke that from Jerry Maguire, you had me at hello, when I met you. And one of the things you said that really struck me was you said, how often as men do we ask each other, how are you?
Yeah.
But not just how are you. We ask how you are all the time, but we're not really interested. How are you in the deep sense?
Yeah.
How are you? I'm interested in you. I want to know what's happening in your heart, not just in your mind. And that's part of what it means to be a father without border to me, is to be the kind of a man who would do that in all the realms of our life and be unafraid to be that kind of a man who would ask that question and actually take an interest deeply in the answer.
It's so true, and I can use an example even up to today. Last week, one of the gentlemen who was at this gathering of black men and mental, you could see he was going through stuff, really and truly. And I said, you know what? Why don't you come by? And for those who don't know, I spend my daytime hours mentoring, helping, and coaching fathers and men. And he came in and was very emotional. He knew that he was doing some things wrong, but he was willing to admit it, and he cried about it. And I said, you know better. And he says, I know you do. I know I do. And I said, I'm here to help you. And I hugged him, because that's a vulnerability moment. He's the first time him and I really sat together across the, and he opened up everything to me. And when a man does that, whoever's listening, that's a big moment. And you have to cheer him up for that. You have to champion for that, because that's a big thing for a lot of men to get to that level, especially with strangers. And you know that a man is going through stuff but is willing to get better.
Yeah, it's true. And that's certainly one of the things we found in our work with firefighters, right? And by the way, there are women who go through the program too, though it's mostly men because it's a male-dominated culture.
Yep.
And in a male-dominated culture, the ability to admit that, wow, I saw this thing and I can't sleep at night now. Or, hey, this is really haunting me. And instead of saying, hey, buck up, Bronco, to be able to really have that kind of authentic, vulnerable conversation is so healing. And I think as men, we often think that we're all permission givers. The moment one of us does that, we're really giving permission to other men to do that. And it's so, so valuable. And none of this is to diminish the role that women play in our lives. But one of the things we've discovered is that just like women need that from men, men need that from other men.
Yes,
and often it's only another man who knows, in some cases, the particular walk you have walked, just like the same is true for women.
Absolutely. And I think what Dr. John and I are doing is we're doing the work. and it's work. It's a true definition of work. And do you see more fathers, more men ready to be vulnerable? Are you seeing a little bit of growth in this area?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think among young men, there is a lot more openness to this. I don't know that they always know how to do it, but they kind of maybe know at least they ought to do it.
I just want to interrupt, what makes the young men ready to do this now compared to we have older guys that just ain't ready, not moving from that rock, but the young guys are ready?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways. One is, and this may be kind of a little bit of a slam on men in a subtle way, is they grew up in a much less segregated world among men and women. A lot more female friends. I don't know about you, when I was a young man, a really young man, till you got interested in girls, you didn't really have girlfriends. The guys went and did their guy thing, the boys went and did their guy things. If you had a sister or something, maybe you got invited to the tea party once in a while, right? But most of us were separated. The boys were sent out because they were loud and aggressive. So I often think that was the beginning of the problem for boys. Is we were noisy and loud, so they sent us outside to play with each other.
Right.
The girls got to stay inside and play with each other around the adults. So we were kind of, in a way, had it bad from the beginning because, they kind of sent us outside and we, played army and argued over who was dead. And so I think that's part of it. So I think they have been influenced more by the female world than maybe other young men have. And certainly we live in a culture that is more amenable now to whether it's therapy or coaching or talking about yourself. You know what I mean? The whole culture, that's mental illness. There's a more general openness to, I think, that whole paradigm. And so I think a lot of younger men have a more desire to be involved fathers, who have more desire to explore this other side of themselves, though they may still not have any much better role modeling from their own fathers, so they may not have any idea how to do it, but they kind of have more of a yearning to do it. And at the same time, there's a counter argument, which is, the growth of pornography and things like this that in a way have maybe even isolated the young male in a way that they were not in previous generations, right? Because of the internet. Yep. So the whole paradigm of the young man by himself playing video games in the basement. Think about that whole paradigm.
Yeah.
About the young man who's not interacting with anyone. So even though I'm optimistic about young men, there's this other trend that's going on, which is the isolation of young men, where they really aren't learning any of these core skills. So I think we do have to be concerned about young men, but I think that generally there is more openness among many young men. I don't know what you think, but that's my
Yeah,
sense.
I agree with you. And something I just came to my mind, and I'm just wondering to get your comment on this. Is fatherhood more of a walk on a tightrope now than ever? Because because of what's going on out there, the different messages. Some fathers say, "Well, I don't know what it's like to be a good father. One side's telling me this, the other, I was raised like this. Society's
Right.
telling me this." It's almost like you're like a Walenda walking across the Niagara Falls.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe so. In some ways, because of the mixed messages. Back to the
Yes.
Homer Simpson, about the bungling, fool father, and then there's all this stuff. We know all the bad things that men do, and I think as men, shame is a very powerful thing for men. Maybe for every human being, but for men in particular, because of the ego,
Yep.
that shame doesn't really motivate us, right? So there has been a lot of shaming of men. Or let me rephrase that: the shaming of male attributes,
Yep.
of competition, of aggression, of sexuality, right? And I think we have to be careful that the shaming of the male attributes is different than the shaming of male bad behavior. So that sexuality is not bad. Aggression in its proper place and competition are not bad things. These qualities have an upside. And again, women have them and men have them. It's just, just as women have probably more nurturing qualities naturally, men may have more aggressive qualities naturally. And again, it makes sense. So I think shame is a big factor, Dr. Vibe, in that we have to be careful not to shame the masculine. And at the Men's Initiative, we've been really clear that this is not about killing the masculine or shaming the masculine. It's about channeling these traditional masculine strengths towards more positive aims, while at the same time nurturing that less developed side of ourselves as men, our nurturing, vulnerable, compassionate, caring side, even while we maintain these things that have really helped us as men, be contributors to society.
It seems like it's a massive unlearning tactic at times.
Yeah, I think it is for many of us, but it's very human work. That's the good news is I often say this isn't men's work; it's human work
Okay.
that men need to do. Right?
I like
The
that.
work of it's the work of looking at the self, of asking what my values are and how I want to be in the world. It's looking at the things that shaped us and asking if we want to do that or whether we want to make a different choice, right? And so to me, it's very human work that just sometimes men have to do that work together, just like women sometimes have to do that work together. So rather than think of this as men's work, this is the work of being an authentic, intentional human being. And this is about men doing some of that work together so we can share the unique struggles and challenges of living that human life as a man.
In this human work for men to be better, because I'm going to use that terminology.
Yeah, yeah.
What has been the biggest challenge so far for you and the
I
Men's
think the big,
Initiative?
yeah, I think the biggest challenge is is men seeing the need. One of the things that struck me, Dr. Vibe, was I shared this experience with you in our pre-conversation that, we were at this gathering in Vermont when we were first starting the initiative, and it was like 100 enlightened men and women. This was, a group of people who are trying to create change in the world. We're all enlightened, but these guys may think of themselves as even more enlightened than the average person, at least in their own minds and behavior that they're demonstrating day to day. And so we put the word out there. We're starting this men's initiative. We're going to, over lunch, anybody who wants to come and talk to us about the work we're doing and give us some ideas, we'd love to hear from you. We were overwhelmed with the response of women wanting to
There
come
you
and
go.
give us ideas.
Yep.
They were like, wow, this is so needed. And let me tell you about my son. And let me tell you about my husband. We were so underwhelmed by the number of men who wanted to be in that conversation. And the interesting thing was men would come up to us one-on-one and go, That's interesting what you guys are doing. I'm not sure I need it, but some men probably do. Or I didn't come because I wondered what other men would think
Yeah.
that I was going to the conversation about fixing men, right? And I thought that was quite telling. That I think the biggest challenge is getting men to see it's okay to have these conversations. Okay to say we need to talk about what it means to be a man, a father, a husband, a son, and what we learned as a man, and how we might want to unlearn some of those things or channel them differently. So I think the real challenge is getting men to see the opportunity, because I think once I remember we were doing this own experience at this conference I was at of entrepreneurs, and a friend of mine, Chris, and I said, why don't we have a men's circle? So we just put the word out there, men's circle, because the women had always had a circle. So we said, well, usually the men are out like doing something else while the women are in a circle. So let's say we're going to have a men's circle this year.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing was, it took almost nothing. All it took was a few men to break the conversation, and we were talking about everything from marriage to competition to sex to our fathers to all these things that in other words, once the cork was opened up, all the men said, we have to do this more often. We didn't know there was this big genie inside this bottle. So I think part of it is getting men to pop the cork, and see what it's like to talk to other men, and suddenly they go, wow, that was good, to have real conversations with other men, not just these kind of surface conversations that we often have, but getting them to try it.
Yes.
I think that's the challenge.
Yeah. As I say to a lot of people, there are a lot of men that are screaming and nothing's coming out.
Yeah. Again, as you are right. We quoted you a number of times, and the other quote, which I've quoted you many times since.
Oh,
when you said that there is nothing more dangerous than a man who is screaming and nothing is coming out. And later, you said something that really struck me. These weren't the exact words, but together we kind of were talking about the fact that because we were talking about male suicide rates, how they've skyrocketed, right? And that if you think about it, a man who's screaming and nothing is coming out, or a human being who's screaming and nothing is coming out, has only two choices, right, as we discussed. One is they can turn it on themselves.
Yep.
Suicide, depression, giving up, or they can turn it onto the world. Violence against women. They can go to the top of a hotel in Las Vegas. I was thinking of you later when we had the Las Vegas shooting, later, a few months after our meeting. And I was thinking, here was a perfect example, because so many of his friends and family said he was kind of a quiet guy. He didn't talk very much. And obviously that guy in Las Vegas was one of those silent screamers. Yeah. Who knows what was going on inside of that man? And instead of turning it against him, well, at first he turned it against the world, then he turned it against himself, right?
Yeah, for many men, the easiest thing is either to quit or anger.
Yeah. And it's the only emotion that often is, anger is like not validated, but like it's okay for a man to be angry, right? Yeah. Righteous anger. Whereas crying, don't be like your sister. Whereas a man is angry, well, stop being such a boy. But they don't. It's almost like the father pats him on the shoulder. Now, that a boy, but tame it down just a little bit. But the boy's crying. Now, what are you doing now? Are you being a sissy, right? And these are the subtle things as men that we, again, hopefully not as prevalent as it used to be.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got to travel tomorrow, and you've been so kind, because I know you're not 100% health-wise, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. Would you like to give any final words when it comes to Fathers Without Borders, for our audience, for men, for women, for those who do the human work to make men better?
Yeah, maybe I'd like to end by sharing just a minute or two about my own story.
Sure, please do.
My father and mother split up when I was 6 months old. I was an only child. They'd only been married for, under a year. They split up. My father moved 2 hours away from me. And although apparently he came to visit me once when I was a year old, I never met my father. He lived 2 hours away from me, died of a heart attack when I was 8 years old. He was only 36.
Wow.
And so I lived with the consequences of a father who, made that choice. And it's taken me, took me a lot of years to have compassion instead of anger for my father. I wonder what it was about his own upbringing. I wonder what it was about even the culture of the time that made it okay for a man to walk away, that he didn't feel that he was valuable. Not taking responsibility away from him, but meaning I started to have a more compassionate conversation with my father's own choices. And then I think of all the men who stepped in their own way, including Bob Kelly, other teachers. And man, I had another high school teacher who, Anthony Pontone, who took a disproportionate interest in me as a young man, in a good way, right? I'm sure he saw the rudderless way in which I was kind of guiding my life in many ways. And so I've had the privilege of many Fathers Without Borders, but also a chance to reflect on the real impact my father's choices had on my life, and also the choices it probably had on his life. Though I'll never be have the purview of that. And the other thing that's interesting is later when I was working with a healer, actually, later in my life, finally confronting my own demons around my father, there was a beautiful moment when the healer said to me, "I want you to get a picture of yourself when you were a young boy." And I got a picture of myself when I was probably about 6 years old, this beautiful picture that had been taken at school that I still have actually in my office. And he said, "I want you to put that picture on the dresser in your bedroom." And I'll back up for just a moment. One of the consequences of my relationship with my father is I would kind of go from woman to woman. I pretty much never felt whole if I didn't have a woman.
Right.
And so, and rather than women really being something to nurture and cherish, it just became something I had to have in my life because I thought I have to have a woman to nurture me, to take care of me. And I had just gone through a divorce and kind of, ready now to go on to the next woman. And this healer said to me, "I want you to put a picture of that young man in your bedroom. And whenever that young man thinks he needs a woman, whenever that young man thinks he needs something, I want you to go to him and say, I know you didn't get what you needed from your father, and I'm sorry about that. But I want you to know I'm here now. I, the adult male, I'm here right now. And I just want you to know that I have what you need. And when you need it, come to me."
Nice.
And so one last element of Father Without Border is if we do this work, even those of us who had maybe a less than perfect relationship with our own fathers can eventually become our own fathers again. And to heal that part of ourselves that was wounded. And that then and only then maybe are we truly capable of helping other men. So that was a great threshold moment for me. And I can't tell you how many times I've thought of that image. That was probably now almost 20 years ago that happened. And but I still carry that image. That's why I keep that picture in my office. So in my more difficult moments, I remind myself how far I've come.
Nice.
And I think this is what I want to say to any man out there, not because I'm there yet, just like you're not there yet.
Nope.
But this is the journey doing this work with other men can give you, where eventually not only can you become the father perhaps you never had to yourself, but then you maybe can become a father to your brothers and friends and other young men in your life. As you heal, you can become a wounded healer to others. So I don't know if that's helpful for anyone out
beautiful.
There, but I wanted to share that.
Am I allowed to use that with some other men?
Sure, please.
Thank you.
Share that
I think
story.
that's powerful. That is very powerful. Well, Dr. John, I'd like to thank you for your time and from your positive, productive schedule. If people want to find out more information about you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so two things. If they want to find out about my work, they can go to drjohnizzo.com. That's just drjohnizz or IZZ, depending on where you're from, o.com. So drjohnizzo.com. .com, no period after the DR.
Yeah.
And if they want to know more about the Men's Initiative at the University of British Columbia, they can go to the Men's Initiative, no apostrophe after the men, themensinitiative.com, and they can find out more about our work and also sign up to stay connected if they want to find out news of things that we're doing down the road.
Excellent. Well, we will put that contact information on the rebroadcast of this epic conversation. I am Dr. Vibe, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, the home of Epic Conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations. If you would like to watch replays of my YouTube conversations, you're at the place, or go to YouTube, put in the search engine, DR_VIBE_SHOW. If you want to listen to audio replays of my Epic Conversations, you go to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn Radio, Google Play Music Store, iHeartRadio. You can hear selected replays of my audio conversations at thegoodmanproject.com and also at WJMSradio.com. I'm also a certified empowerment coach, president and CEO of Express Your Vibe Coaching and Communications. If you'd like a complimentary session, please touch base with me via Twitter at DRVIBESHOW. You can email me, dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com, or you can go to my website, click on the Contact Dr. Vibe Show, and we'll take it from there. Also, I'm a brand ambassador for the only online magazine dedicated to African Americans in food, wine, and travel. The name of the magazine is Cuisine Noir Magazine. The website address is cuisinenoirmag.com. Also, I provide a service called Getting Media Coverage, where I help businesses and entrepreneurs get media promotion so they can elevate their business. So you can contact me on that. As always, I say three last things at the end of my epic conversations. Live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. And also, sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. God bless. Peace be well. Keep the faith. Thanks so much for watching the conversation. And as we say, walk good. Good night, everybody. What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning The Dr. Vibe Show. I have hosted and produced over 2,000 epic conversations over the last 10 years. And what makes our conversations epic? We don't do interviews. We do conversations.